World War III has broken out and fighting is escalating around the world. China versus Taiwan and the US, North versus South Korea, Russia versus Europe, and various skirmishes in the Middle East. Where does Australia fit into this hypothetical scenario, and what has the worldwide conflict done to our economy? Today we're following up our video on what Australia's role in a World War III scenario would be. I'm Pikos, and today we're talking tactics. The war so far. Firstly, let's just do a quick recap on the first part of our World War III series. Our scenario starts in 2027 with China launching a massive bombardment of Taiwan and establishing a naval blockade of the island. This is quickly followed up with an amphibious invasion, which successfully establishes several beachheads, but fails to rapidly capture the whole island. The US and its allies, including Australia, begin striking Chinese ships off the east coast of the island to break the blockade and assist Taiwan. Australia rapidly deploys suitable air and naval assets to the fighting around Taiwan. Then, to stop South Korea from offering assistance to US and allies, China convinces North Korea to invade the south. Australia deploys special forces to help South Korea repel the invasion. Russia takes the opportunity to invade Lithuania, knowing that the US and its Pacific allies will be too distracted to assist Europe. However, this quickly becomes a broader war between Europe and Russia, with Russia going onto the defensive. In the Middle East, Iran and its Houthi proxies in Yemen start attacking allied shipping traveling through the Persian Gulf and the Red Sea. The fighting continues. Picking up where we left off in the previous video, the Korean front remains bogged down, with the massive North Korean army being held at bay by the better equipped, better trained, and dug-in South Korean forces. As the Australian army rapidly swells with new volunteers, its leaders are desperate to deploy at least a combat brigade into the fight in Korea. But Australia still hasn't been able to build or import enough modern armoured combat vehicles to equip a full brigade yet. With most of Australia's allies now involved in the war, imports of war materials are hard to come by, as more industrialised allies are busy equipping their own forces. In Europe, not only has Russia's invasion into the Suwalki Gap failed, but they have been forced to go on the defensive as more and more NATO countries become actively involved in the war. Significant NATO air and sea assets deploy into the Black and Baltic Seas, quickly overcoming Russia's surface fleets there and cutting formerly important trade routes. In the north, Finland begins to skirmish with Russian forces along their long border, forcing Russia to pull troops from other sectors to shore up their defences there. Ukraine senses Russia's weakness and rapidly begins to take back land it had lost in previous invasions. With Russian forces stretched increasingly thin, a large NATO force begins massing in Warmia Masuria with the intention of advancing into Russian Kaliningrad. Initially, things are going more positively for China in Taiwan. One of China's beachheads on Taiwan is the northwestern part of the island. In a grinding eastern advance from this beachhead, the PLA start to threaten Taiwan's capital at Taipei. While the Taiwanese fight bravely, their numbers simply can't compare with the sheer mass of China's, and things start to look grim for the defenders. However, despite China's seemingly limitless forces, in actuality the Taiwanese defenders, combined with supporting US and allied air and naval assets, have succeeded in significantly weakening China's logistical support capacity. So just as China's forces in Taiwan are starting to get large enough to overcome Taiwan's defenders, the PLA's capacity to move enough ammunition and supplies in from the mainland to sustain this force is becoming more and more limited. At this rate, the Chinese know that their forces will run out of supplies before they finish off the Taiwanese defenders. Australia attacked. In a surprise attack, Australia is hit directly. Air bases across the north of the country, including RAF Darwin, RAF Tyndall, and RAF Curtin, are each struck by multiple missiles. The limited anti-missile defences the ADF have in the area are insufficient to knock more than a few of these incoming missiles out of the sky. A number of ADF personnel are killed and injured in the attack, and the bases are damaged, limiting the ability of the RAF to operate in the area until they can be repaired. The strikes turn out to be launched from H-6 bombers flying down from southern China, firing their missiles from just north of Indonesia. It's a move that shocks Australia. It's the first time Australia has been attacked since World War II. China has made the daring call to strike Australia directly, based on the calculation that a number of strikes on the Australian mainland would be all it would take to shift public opinion away from the continued involvement in the war. The Chinese military has gambled that it is worth diverting scarce military resources from the war effort around Taiwan in order to try and knock Australia out of the war. If they succeed, they will remove the ADF from the equation, and more critically, they will prevent the US from using our bases and therefore reduce the effectiveness of US forces operating around Taiwan. After the shock of the attack wears off, Australians feel exposed. Some of our best forces are deployed in North Asia, and the US is too distracted to help in a decisive way. The first priority is starting the process of recalling our Super Hornets and air-to-air refuelers back to bases in Northern Australia. These fighters have a longer range than the F-35s still in Australia and are more likely to be able to intercept H-6s if they launch future sorties against our bases. We also beg the US for a shipment of the ultra-long-range air-to-air missiles, the AIM-174B, in order to better defend from long-range attacks. However, with the US's own stocks running low, it's unlikely they will send these critical munitions to an ally anytime soon. Unfortunately for Australia, the H-6 strikes are only the first phase of China's attack against Australia. A Chinese task force is detected sailing down the South China Sea, close to the Vietnamese coast. The task force consists of a lead destroyer, 2 escort frigates, a couple of submarines, and a tanker. As it makes a run down the Carimata Strait and into the Java Sea, it becomes clear that the task force aims to attack Australia. However, Indonesia, resenting the lack of respect China has shown in firing missiles through their airspace and sailing warships through waters they claim, pass intelligence onto Australia. This proves critical when the task force turns towards the Sunda Strait. Now knowing exactly where the Chinese task force will emerge, the ADF rushes forces to the area. Precision strike missiles armed HIMARS are airlifted to Christmas Island and the Cocos Islands. Several Anzac frigates and a Collins-class submarine steam to the area at full speed. And finally, most of the F-35As, FA-18F Super Hornets, and P-8A Poseidons still in the country also rush to the area. It's critical that the ADF engage and defeat the Chinese flotilla as it comes out of the Sunda Strait. The Type 055 destroyer leading the force has 112 missile cells. It becomes clear that the task force intends to take advantage of Australia's west coast being more isolated and less well defended. More specifically, they intend to knock out HMAS Sterling and the Henderson submarine facilities in Perth, preventing the US Navy and the RAN from using this vital submarine base and potentially causing significant civilian casualties if Perth itself is targeted. Between this and the bombardment in the north, China hopes that this will be enough for Australia to remove itself from the conflict. The RAN struggles to reach the combat zone in time, just south of the Sunda Strait, but the overconfident Chinese flotilla edge into the range of the HIMARS battery stationed on Christmas Island. The precision strike missiles prove effective at range and are joined by RAF sorties of F-35s, Super Hornets and Poseidons, all equipped with modern air-to-sea missiles. All hell breaks loose as a missile exchange develops between Australia and Chinese forces. However, the ADF emerges victorious due to being able to rapidly concentrate superior firepower on the Chinese task force and its edge in missile technology and electronic warfare. ADF losses are light, half a dozen aircraft are shot down, and a handful of gunners are killed or wounded when their positions on Christmas Island are hit. On the other hand, the ravaged Chinese flotilla lose their destroyer flagship as well as one of the escort frigates. The remaining frigate and tanker flee towards the relative safety of the Sunda Strait. However, the tanker is intercepted and sunk before it can get far, although the second frigate is able to escape. The submarines attached to the task force are harder to intercept, and even when the surface vessels are destroyed or flee, they continue southeast toward the Australian coast. Just south of Christmas Island, one of the submarines encounter an Anzac frigate, which had been moving to help intercept the Chinese task force. The Chinese submarine is able to successfully sink the frigate, leading to the deaths of 20 Australian sailors, although the bulk of the crew is rescued. The submarines continue south and spend the rest of the war attacking Australian shipping routes, laying mines and destroying undersea communications cables. Considerable anti-submarine forces are deployed to neutralise them. However, the vast size of Australia's coastline makes the job very difficult for our small Navy and Air Force. The Battle of Christmas Island is celebrated as a successful defence of the country, giving Australians more confidence in their ability to fight against China, although the loss of the Anzac frigate makes the victory bittersweet. The economic impact on Australia. So the war rolls on. Australia itself has been attacked, but the threat has been beaten back for now. But what has this war been doing to the Australian economy? As I mentioned in the first part of this video series, China, Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan combined are responsible for about half of Australia's total imports and exports, and we are cut off from these markets at the start of the war. The attacks on shipping in the Persian Gulf and the Red Sea, and the fact that there are 2 Chinese submarines prowling Australian waters, are further blows to the Australian economy, and trade is massively disrupted. Despite this disruption in trade, the actual value of imports increases as fast as Australia can organise shipping. Goods important to the war effort are imported in whatever numbers can be procured from neutral countries and regions such as India, Latin America, and Africa. These include fuel, machinery, steel, aluminium, pharmaceuticals, and many other things. One thing that Australia is very much in surplus of is food, so at least no one in Australia is at risk of starving. Pre-war, Australia imported about 90% of its refined fuel, mostly via Asia. However, war immediately cut most of these sources. Additionally, Australia's strategic fuel reserves are extremely limited. Australia scrambles to import fuels from other sources and in the longer term expands its own production, but in the meantime, fuel rationing becomes a necessity. In some cases, electrification helps things keep ticking over, but regardless, the military get the top priority allocation of fuel, followed by industry, and households are left with very little. Personal travel in a petrol car quickly becomes a rare luxury. This is why I've got one electric car and a battery at home. Almost immediately upon the start of the war, the Australian government ramps up its industrial mobilisation and defence spending to levels not seen since World War II. Although our manufacturing capability is being rebuilt from a low base, the government throws a huge amount of our wealth and resources into rapidly expanding the production of things like munitions, small arms, missiles, vehicles, and spare parts. All this spending results in the government quickly accumulating a massive amount of debt, but paying that back is a problem for after the war. Any industries that might be useful to the war effort or which have production lines easily converted to make war material are pretty much forced to do so by the government, but at least they make money via government supply contracts. Between the massive expansion of the ADF as well as the expansion of industries that supply defence, unemployment disappears almost instantly. In fact, as time goes by, it's more likely to see severe labour shortage in certain industries. The government tries to get as much out of its labour pool by incentivising people not already in the labour force back into employment. Think stay-at-home parents, people with moderate disabilities, and younger retirees. But this only reduces labour shortages, doesn't completely solve the problem. All this combines to make economic policy tricky to balance. At the same time as Australia's imports skyrocket, our exports nosedive, as we need to keep more of our own produced goods and resources for the war effort or for our own domestic needs. This causes the value of the Australian dollar to drop and puts pressure on interest rates to increase. But because of the amount of money Australia is borrowing and printing, keeping interest rates low is critical, and so maintaining the value of the Australian dollar is vitally important. Also, rock bottom unemployment unemployment puts pressure on inflation rates. To keep inflation under control, the government can either impose price controls on certain goods and services, or increase taxes and introduce rationing to reduce consumption. The government ends up picking and choosing a combination of all three of these policies. If the war lasts for more than a few months, Australia is likely to emerge from it with a radically different economy. Even after the war, unemployment will be very low and manufacturing will be a major employer again. However, this reindustrialisation of the Australian economy will come at the cost of high levels of government debt and households with less material wealth than they had before the war. Is there an end in sight? So that's where we're at. Australia has been attacked for the first time since World War II, but we've managed to fight off the attack, and it looks like the allies across the world have fought their opponents largely to a standstill. But the fighting is still ongoing with no obvious end in sight. Casualties on both sides increase, and there is still the spectre of nuclear war hanging over everyone's heads. What do you think about the economic impacts of a major global war on Australia? Is there anything that you think would play out differently? Let me know in the comments section down below. And if you're interested, I'll make a final video concluding this series, having a look at how the war might affect the lives of everyday Australians. That's it for today. My name's Pikos, and we've been talking tactics.